Clara felt the polite smile on her face stretching into something brittle, a piece of porcelain threatening to crack under the strain of the perfectly orchestrated joy surrounding her. The air, thick with the scent of lilies and expensive champagne, felt heavy in her lungs, each breath a conscious effort. She sat at a table in the far corner of the lavishly decorated ballroom, a solitary island in a sea of shimmering silk and dark tuxedos. Table 17. The designation felt intentional, a subtle banishment to the social Siberia of distant cousins and former colleagues, a place for people who had to be invited but were not expected to be celebrated. It was Mark's wedding, after all. Her ex-husband. And she was here, a living ghost at the feast of his new life, a testament to a past he had so successfully shed. Her presence was a final, quiet concession, a promise she had made to their son, Leo, who had asked with wide, 7-year-old eyes if she was going to Daddy's party. She had said yes, because saying no would have required an explanation she did not have the strength to give. Her vulnerability was a physical thing, a raw nerve exposed to the glittering chaos of the reception. It was in the way her fingers worried the stem of her water glass, leaving faint, damp prints on the condensation. It was in the careful, measured way she kept her spine straight, a silent defiance against the urge to shrink into herself and disappear. The financial pressure was a constant, low-grade hum beneath the surface of her thoughts, a stark contrast to the casual opulence on display. The dress she wore, a simple navy sheath, was the result of 3 weeks of careful budgeting and a fortuitous sale, yet it felt like a homespun costume in a room of couture. Loneliness was her uninvited guest, sitting beside her in the empty chair, its weight a familiar ache. For 5 years, she had been a single unit, Clara and Leo. A team. But in moments like this, surrounded by couples who leaned into each other with unconscious ease, the singularity of her existence felt less like independence and more like a profound, echoing isolation. The weight of it all, the mortgage on their small house, Leo's upcoming dental appointment, the looming uncertainty of her freelance bookkeeping work, pressed down, making the forced smile feel heavier with each passing minute. The band transitioned from a gentle dinner melody to something with a more insistent beat. Couples began to drift toward the polished dance floor, a swirling kaleidoscope of color and laughter. Mark and his new bride, a woman who seemed to be composed entirely of sunshine and effortless grace, were at the center of it, their happiness a brilliant, painful spotlight. Clara watched for a moment, an anthropologist studying a foreign tribe, then let her gaze drop to the half-eaten slice of lemon tart on her plate. She was tracing the pattern of the forked tines in the cream when a shadow fell over her table. She did not look up immediately, assuming it was a waiter clearing the plates, a small reprieve she was grateful for. But the shadow remained, patient and solid. When she finally lifted her head, her polite, dismissive words died on her lips. A man stood there, his presence so commanding it seemed to suck the ambient noise into a vacuum around them. He was tall, dressed in a tuxedo so perfectly tailored it seemed a part of him, the dark fabric a stark contrast to the crisp white of his shirt. He was not handsome in the classical, soft way Mark was. His features were sharper, more defined, as if carved from something unyielding. There was an intensity in his dark eyes, a stillness that set him apart from the boisterous celebration. She recognized him vaguely from the ceremony. He had been on the groom's side, seated near the front. A business associate, perhaps. One of the titans of industry Mark so admired. He looked at her, his gaze direct and unervingly perceptive, as if he could see past the carefully constructed facade to the weary woman beneath. He did not smile, not exactly, but the corner of his mouth tilted in something that acknowledged the absurdity of their situation. He extended a hand. It was a large hand, clean and unadorned, no ring on his finger. His voice, when he spoke, was a low, resonant baritone that cut through the music without being loud. "Let us dance." It was not a question. It was a statement, a gentle command that offered no room for refusal, yet felt strangely like a rescue. Clara stared at his outstretched hand, her mind a blank slate. Every instinct screamed at her to refuse, to retreat into the safety of her corner table. But the thought of sitting there for another hour, a spectacle of dignified solitude, was suddenly unbearable. Slowly, as if moving through water, she placed her small hand in his. His grip was warm and firm, a steady anchor in the swirling tide of the reception. He led her toward the dance floor, his movements economical and sure, parting the crowd without a word. As they stepped onto the polished floor, he drew her into a formal hold, one hand resting lightly but possessively on the small of her back, the other enveloping hers. The distance between them was proper, yet it felt more intimate than any embrace she had shared in years. They began to move, falling into the rhythm of the slow song that had just begun. He was an excellent dancer, leading with a quiet confidence that required no effort on her part. For the first few moments, she was stiff, her body a rigid collection of anxieties. She was acutely aware of the other dancers, of the possibility that Mark was watching, that people were speculating. Who was this woman, the forgotten first wife, dancing with the most formidable-looking men in the room? She kept her eyes fixed on the knot of his black bow tie, a safe, neutral territory. He was the one who broke the silence. He did not ask her name or how she knew the groom. His question was far more direct, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "Why did you come?" The question caught her off guard. She had been expecting polite, meaningless small talk. This was something else entirely. She finally met his eyes and was struck again by their intensity. They were not judging, merely observant. He genuinely seemed to want to know. "I made a promise," she said, her voice softer than she intended. "To my son." A flicker of something, understanding, perhaps empathy, crossed his face. It was there and gone in an instant, but it was enough to make her feel a fraction less exposed. He did not press for details. He simply nodded, a small, sharp movement of his head. He held her gaze for a beat longer, and in that moment, she began her assessment of him. There was the obvious, of course. The suit was likely Italian, bespoke. The watch on his wrist was subtle but spoke of quiet, astronomical expense. His posture was one of ingrained authority, the kind that comes from years of being the most important person in any room he entered. He moved with an economy of motion that suggested immense power held in careful reserve. This was a man accustomed to control, to having his world operate on his terms. But as they swayed to the music, Clara noticed other things, smaller details that painted a more complex picture. There was a faint, silvery scar that cut through his left eyebrow, a tiny imperfection that made his face more interesting, more human. She saw a deep-seated weariness in the lines around his eyes, a tiredness that the perfect tuxedo and confident demeanor could not quite conceal. It was the look of a man who carried immense weight, not all of it related to business. She sensed a profound loneliness in him, a mirror to her own, though his was forged in a world of wealth and power, and hers in the quiet landscape of single motherhood. He was like a fortress, formidable and imposing on the outside, but she suspected the halls within were vast and empty. He seemed to sense the shift in her attention, the moment her observation turned from a surface-level appraisal to a deeper, more intuitive reading. His grip on her hand tightened ever so slightly. "Most people here are performing," he stated, his eyes scanning the room with a cool, detached air. "They are trying to be seen with the right people, to make the right impression." He paused, his gaze returning to her. "You are not. You are simply trying not to be seen at all." The accuracy of his observation was so startling it felt like a violation, yet it was delivered with such matter-of-fact calm that it felt like a shared confidence. Clara found she could not disagree. "It is not my celebration," she said simply. His response was a low hum of agreement. "Integrity is a rare commodity in rooms like this," he murmured, almost to himself. He looked at her then, a genuine, searching look. He was seeing her. Not the ex-wife, not the woman at the forgotten table, but a person. And in that moment of being truly seen, something inside her that had been clenched tight for years began to cautiously, tentatively, unfurl. The song ended, the final notes fading into the ambient chatter. For a moment, they remained still, the spell unbroken. Then he released her hand and took a small step back, the formal distance returning. "Thank you for the dance," he said. His name was Julian Croft. He did not offer any further explanation of who he was or what he was doing there, and then he was gone, melting back into the crowd as seamlessly as he had appeared. Clara stood alone on the edge of the dance floor, the warmth of his hand still lingering on hers, feeling as though the entire axis of her world had just shifted. The days following the wedding fell back into their familiar rhythm, a comforting litany of school runs, grocery lists, and the quiet click of her keyboard as she reconciled accounts for her small handful of clients. The memory of the wedding, and of Julian Croft, began to feel like a strange, vivid dream, an anomaly in the carefully ordered reality of her life. She relegated it to a mental file labeled, bizarre and unlikely events, alongside the time Leo had tried to pay for milk with a fistful of dandelions. She was working late one evening, the house silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the gentle sound of her son's breathing from his room down the hall. A new email notification pinged, and she opened it without much thought, expecting it to be a query from her client, a local bakery. The sender's name, however, was J. Croft. Her heart gave a sudden, sharp jolt. The email was brief, devoid of any social pleasantries. It stated simply that he had been given her professional contact information by Mark, and that he required assistance with a complex set of personal financial records. It proposed a meeting the following day at an address downtown. There was no mention of the wedding, no acknowledgement of their dance. It was a stark, professional inquiry. Clara read the email 3 times, a storm of conflicting emotions warring within her. Her first instinct was a deep, ingrained skepticism. This was Mark's world, a world of transactions where nothing was ever as it seemed. Was this some kind of test? A favor Mark had asked of his powerful friend, a pity job thrown her way. The thought was humiliating. Her pride, the one thing she had managed to keep polished and intact through the divorce and the subsequent struggles, recoiled at the idea of being a charity case. She typed out a polite refusal, thanking him for the offer but stating that her current workload was too demanding. Her finger hovered over the send button. But then, another thought pushed through the pride. It was work. Good, high-level work, if the man's reputation, which she had, of course, immediately researched, was anything to go by. Julian Croft was a titan of real estate development, a man whose name was synonymous with some of the city's most ambitious architectural projects. Working for him, even on a short-term project, would be a significant step up from balancing the books for bakeries and small law firms. It meant security. It meant she could finally replace the worn tires on her car without having to dip into her emergency savings. It meant a little more breathing room in a life that often felt suffocatingly tight. Hope, a fragile and unfamiliar sensation, began to bloom in the barren soil of her doubt. What if it was real? What if he had seen not a pitiable ex-wife, but a competent professional? His words at the wedding echoed in her mind, integrity is a rare commodity. Perhaps that was what he was looking for. Not charity, but character. She deleted the polite refusal. She took a deep breath, the scent of old paper and brewing coffee filling her small home office. She thought of Leo, sleeping soundly in his bed, his small face untroubled. Everything she did, every risk she weighed, was for him. She typed a new reply, one that was as professional and direct as his own. She confirmed her availability for the meeting and thanked him for the opportunity. She pressed send before she could second-guess herself. The decision was made. It was a step into the unknown, a departure from the safe, predictable path she had carved out for herself. As she shut down her computer for the night, she felt a tremor of fear, but beneath it, something else stirred, a flicker of excitement, a sense of possibility she had not allowed herself to feel in a very long time. She was venturing into the lion's den, but for the first time, she felt she might be able to hold her own. The address was a sleek, imposing skyscraper of black glass and steel that pierced the downtown skyline. The lobby was a cavern of marble and hushed efficiency, a world away from her cozy, cluttered bungalow. When she gave her name to the receptionist, she was directed to a private elevator that opened directly into Julian Croft's penthouse office. The space was vast and minimalist, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a breathtaking panorama of the city below. It was a view from the heavens, a perspective of absolute power. Julian was not sitting behind the enormous mahogany desk that dominated one side of the room. Instead, he stood by the window, looking out at the city he had helped to build. He turned as she entered, and for a moment, they simply looked at each other across the expanse of polished floor. He was dressed in a simple gray suit, the severity of it softened by the absence of a tie. He looked just as formidable as he had at the wedding, but in his own environment, the weariness she had glimpsed seemed more pronounced. He gestured to a seating area with 2 leather armchairs and a low glass table. He did not offer her a drink or engage in small talk. He got straight to the point. "I am in the process of establishing a charitable foundation," he began, his voice the same low, steady baritone she remembered. "It will focus on providing architectural scholarships and funding for sustainable urban housing projects. I need someone to handle the initial financial structuring and to conduct a thorough audit of the seed funding, which is being drawn from several of my private accounts." He paused, his dark eyes fixed on her. "I need someone meticulous, discreet, and trustworthy. Mark mentioned your work. He also mentioned your circumstances." He said the last word with a faint, almost imperceptible note of distaste, as if the idea of discussing her personal life was offensive to him. "My circumstances have no bearing on the quality of my work," Clara said, her voice quiet but firm. A flash of approval lit his eyes. "I am aware. That is why you are here." He gestured to a stack of thick binders on the table. "This is the preliminary documentation. I require a complete and transparent accounting of every asset. I need to know that the foundation is being built on solid, unimpeachable ground." It was an offer, and it was a test. He was giving her access to the intricate, private details of his financial empire. He was trusting her not just with numbers, but with his reputation. She spent the next few weeks immersed in the world of Julian Croft's finances. He provided her with a small, empty office in the building, a quiet, sterile space that became her sanctuary. Day after day, she sat with his records, the numbers and figures telling a story of immense success, shrewd investments, and relentless ambition. She worked with a focused intensity, her natural meticulousness sharpened by the high stakes of the project. She traced the flow of capital from holding companies to investment portfolios, cross-referencing every transaction, flagging every minor inconsistency for clarification. It was complex, demanding work, and she loved it. It was a puzzle, and she had always been good at puzzles. It engaged a part of her mind that had been dormant for too long, a sharp, analytical part that had been dulled by the repetitive simplicity of her usual jobs. She was proving to herself, more than anyone, that she was still capable, that the woman who had once been at the top of her accounting class had not been entirely lost to the demands of motherhood and the disappointments of a failed marriage. Their interactions during this time were brief and strictly professional, yet they formed the foundation of a quiet, evolving rapport. He would often find her in the office late in the evening, her head bent over a ledger, a pen tucked behind her ear. He never commented on her long hours, but one evening, he appeared at her door with 2 cups of coffee from the expensive cafe downstairs. He placed one on her desk without a word and leaned against the doorframe, sipping his own. "How is Leo?" he asked, the question so unexpected it made her look up in surprise. "He is well," she answered, a little thrown. "He has a loose tooth he is very proud of." A genuine, fleeting smile touched Julian's lips, transforming his severe features. It was the first time she had seen him truly smile, and the effect was startling. "My nephew went through that phase." Insisted on showing his loose tooth to every person he met. For a few minutes, they talked not as employer and employee, but as two people. He asked about Leo's school, about what she did to relax. She learned that he had a sister with 2 young children, that he found solace in sailing, and that he despised cilantro with a passion that seemed disproportionate to the herb itself. These small, quiet moments were like stones dropped into a still pond, creating ripples that expanded outward, slowly changing the nature of the space between them. One afternoon, he came into her office to ask a question about a specific trust fund. He stopped short when he saw the small, framed drawing on the corner of her desk. It was one of Leo's, a chaotic but joyful depiction of a blue dinosaur eating a red car. He picked it up, his large hand surprisingly gentle as he held the small frame. "A T-Rex?" he asked. Clara nodded. "His favorite. He has an entire, elaborate mythology built around him. His name is Captain Stompy." Julian studied the drawing for a long moment, a thoughtful, almost wistful expression on his face. He put it back on her desk carefully. "He is a good artist." The simple, sincere compliment resonated with Clara more than any praise for her own work ever could. He saw not just a child's drawing, but the imagination and heart behind it. He saw her son. The moment of real connection, the one that shifted their dynamic from a professional relationship with friendly undertones to something more profound, came unexpectedly. She had stayed exceptionally late to finish a particularly complex reconciliation. It was past 9, and the entire floor was dark and silent, save for the light spilling from her office and the one at the far end of the hall, Julian's. She was packing up her bag when he appeared at her door. He looked exhausted, the lines around his eyes etched deeper than usual. He did not say anything, just stood there for a moment, watching her. "I had a business partner once," he said suddenly, his voice low and raw in the quiet building. "My first real venture, years ago. We built it from nothing. I trusted him completely. More than my own family, in some ways." He looked away from her, his gaze fixed on the glittering cityscape outside the window. "He embezzled millions. Almost ruined me. But the money was not the worst part. The worst part was the betrayal. To realize that the entire foundation of what you have built is rotten from the inside. He finally looked back at her, and his eyes were stripped of their usual guardedness. In their depths, she saw a profound and aching vulnerability. That is why I need this foundation to be perfect, Clara. I need to build something that is clean. Something I can trust. In that moment, he was no longer Julian Croft, the billionaire real estate magnate. He was just a man who had been deeply wounded, a man who was trying, in his own way, to heal. The confession hung in the air between them, a fragile and precious thing. It was a gift of trust, and it equalized them in a way nothing else could. She understood then that his obsession with integrity was not just a business principle, it was a deeply personal creed, forged in the fire of a devastating betrayal. It was a Tuesday afternoon, 2 months into the project, when she found it. She was in the final stages of the audit, reviewing the source accounts for the seed funding. It was a meticulous, almost mind-numbing process of cross-referencing transfer authorizations with bank statements, a task many would find tedious, but which she found strangely soothing, like restoring order to a chaotic universe. She was examining a series of transfers from a private investment portfolio managed by a man named Alastair Finch, Julian's longtime financial advisor and a man he had mentioned with rare warmth. The numbers all matched, the authorizations were all signed. Everything appeared to be in perfect order. But there was something nagging at the edge of her perception, a faint discord in the harmony of the numbers. It was a pattern, subtle and almost invisible. A series of small, seemingly random withdrawals from the main account, all made over the past 18 months, all categorized under discretionary consultation fees. The amounts were insignificant on their own, a drop in the ocean of Julian's wealth, easily overlooked. But when she aggregated them, they totaled a staggering sum, well over 7 figures. And they all traced back to a shell corporation she had never seen before. A corporation whose sole director was Alastair Finch's wife. The blood drained from her face. She felt a cold, sick dread pool in her stomach. She ran the numbers again. And then a third time. There was no mistake. It was a classic, slow-bleed embezzlement scheme, executed with patience and precision by the one man Julian seemed to trust implicitly. The man he had lunch with every Thursday. The man who was godfather to his nephew. The betrayal he had spoken of so painfully was happening all over again, right under his nose, and she was the one who had uncovered it. Her first thought was a wave of pure, unadulterated fear. What was she supposed to do with this information? To present this to Julian would be like taking a scalpel to his old wound and cutting it open again. It would devastate him. It could also destroy her. She was a temporary contractor, a nobody. Finch was a pillar of the financial community, Julian's trusted friend. It would be her word against his. He could crush her, ruin her professional reputation with a single phone call. The safe thing to do, the smart thing, would be to ignore it. To pretend she had never seen it. To finish her report on the official transfers and walk away. No one would ever know. She sat at her desk for a full hour, the damning spreadsheet glowing on her screen, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She thought about her own life, about the lies Mark had told, the small deceptions that had grown into a mountain of betrayal that had eventually crushed their marriage. She remembered Julian's face when he had spoken of his first partner, the raw pain in his eyes. He had hired her for her integrity. He had trusted her. To stay silent would not just be an act of professional cowardice, it would be a betrayal of that trust. It would make her a party to the deception. She thought of Leo, and the kind of person she wanted him to see when he looked at his mother. She wanted him to see someone strong, someone who did the right thing, especially when it was hard. She was working on it. She was working on being that person. She saved the file onto a secure thumb drive, printed out the relevant documents, and placed them in a sealed manila envelope. Her hands trembled slightly as she walked the long, silent hallway to Julian's office. He was on the phone when she reached his open door, his back to her as he looked out the window. He was speaking in a low, sharp tone, the sound of a man accustomed to command. She waited, her heart in her throat, the envelope feeling as heavy as a block of lead in her hands. When he finished his call and turned, his expression softened slightly when he saw her. "Clara. I was just about to leave. Is everything all right?" She could not speak. She simply walked to his desk and placed the envelope in the center of the polished mahogany surface. He looked from the envelope to her face, his brow furrowing in concern at her pale, strained expression. He sat down and opened it, his movements deliberate. She watched as he pulled out the papers, his eyes scanning the columns of numbers. She saw the exact moment he understood. A stillness came over him, a terrifying, absolute lack of motion. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin taut and gray over the sharp bones. He did not look up. He just stared at the page, his knuckles white where he gripped the edge of his desk. The silence in the room was immense, a living thing that pressed in on her from all sides. When he finally spoke, his voice was a ghost of its usual self, a low, ragged whisper. "Alistair." It was not a question. It was a statement of profound, soul-crushing disbelief. He looked up at her then, and the raw agony in his eyes was so intense she almost had to look away. There was no anger directed at her, no suspicion, no lashing out. There was only a devastating, bottomless well of pain. He had built his fortress so high, and the enemy had been inside the walls the entire time. In that moment, his reaction told her everything she needed to know. Unlike Mark, who would have yelled, deflected, or blamed the messenger, Julian absorbed the blow with a terrifying, quiet gravity. He trusted her. He believed her. He did not question her findings for a second. He motioned to the chair opposite his desk. "Tell me everything," he said, his voice regaining a sliver of its usual command, though it was now edged with steel. And as she sat and walked him through her discovery, line by painstaking line, she was no longer just his bookkeeper. She was his ally, his confidant, the only person in his entire world he knew, with absolute certainty, he could trust. The days that followed were a blur of quiet, focused activity. Julian moved with a lethal, chilling precision. There were no dramatic confrontations or explosive accusations. Instead, he worked with a team of lawyers he brought in from out of state, operating with the strategic calm of a general preparing for a decisive battle. He included Clara in every step of the process. She sat in on meetings, her presence a silent testament to the source of the information. The high-powered attorneys initially looked at her with dismissive curiosity, but they quickly learned to respect her encyclopedic knowledge of the records and her quiet, unshakable confidence in her findings. Julian never once made her feel like a subordinate. He treated her as a partner. He would ask for her opinion, listen intently to her analysis, and value her perspective. They worked late into the night, fueled by coffee and a shared sense of purpose. In the crucible of this crisis, a new and powerful bond was forged between them, one built on mutual respect and absolute trust. She saw a side of him that few ever did, a man who was ruthless in his pursuit of justice but who was also grieving the loss of a friendship he had cherished. He was not a machine, he was a man who felt the wound deeply, but who refused to let it break him. The resolution came not with a bang, but with a quiet, decisive click. Alistair Finch was confronted in a sterile boardroom, presented with an airtight case of irrefutable evidence. There was no trial. He signed a full confession and a restitution agreement that stripped him of nearly everything he owned. He was disgraced, his career and reputation obliterated in a single, quiet afternoon. Clara was not present for the confrontation, a deliberate choice by Julian to shield her from the ugliness of it. He came to her office afterwards. The ordeal was over, and the immense tension that had gripped the office for a week finally dissipated. He stood in the doorway, looking tired but resolute. "The foundation is clean," he said. "Thanks to you." He walked over to her desk and sat in the chair opposite her, the one where clients usually sat, a subtle shift in their dynamic. "Clara," he began, his voice serious, "I owe you more than a professional fee. You brought me the truth, even when it was dangerous and difficult. You did not flinch. In my world, that is almost unheard of." He looked at her, and the professional veil between them seemed to dissolve completely. "I have spent years building walls to protect myself," he said, his voice low and intensely personal. "I have kept everyone at a distance. It is a lonely way to live, but I thought it was the only way to be safe. You walked past all of those defenses, not by trying to tear them down, but simply by being yourself. By being honest." He leaned forward slightly, his gaze unwavering. "This has not been about the books for a long time, has it?" Clara's heart, which had been beating a steady rhythm, began to pound. No, she whispered, the single word holding a universe of unspoken feelings. It has not. A slow, genuine smile spread across his face, the one she had seen only once before. It reached his eyes, erasing the last traces of weariness and pain. Good, he said. Then have dinner with me, Clara. Not as my accountant. Not as my ally in a crisis. Just as you. She said yes. The word felt simple, yet momentous. It was an acceptance not just of a dinner invitation, but of a new and hopeful future, a future she had not dared to imagine for herself. It was a step out of the shadows of her past and into the possibility of a shared light. The transition was seamless, as if they had been moving toward this conclusion all along. Their first dinner was not at a flashy, expensive restaurant, but at a quiet, unassuming Italian place in a neighborhood she knew well. They talked for hours, not about finances or betrayal, but about books, and travel, and childhood memories. She told him about Leo's obsession with space, and he told her about his failed attempt to build a sailboat in his father's garage as a teenager. He was witty and insightful, and he listened, truly listened, with an intensity that made her feel like she was the only person in the world. She found herself laughing, a real, unburdened laugh that felt rusty from disuse. She felt happy. It was a simple, profound, and utterly astonishing feeling. Months later, the new reality had settled into a comfortable, beautiful rhythm. Her life was still her own, she had insisted on keeping her small house, her own clients, her independence, but it was now interwoven with his. He had folded himself into her world with a surprising, gentle grace. He never tried to change her or her life with grand gestures of wealth. Instead, his presence was felt in small, meaningful ways. He showed up to Leo's soccer game on a Saturday morning, cheering louder than anyone when Leo scored a goal. He learned how to make pancakes, a skill he attacked with the same focused determination he applied to a corporate acquisition, resulting in several burnt offerings before he finally produced a stack that met Leo's discerning standards. He would sit with them in the evenings, on the slightly worn sofa in her living room, helping Leo with a 1,000-piece puzzle of the solar system, his large, capable hands carefully placing a piece of Saturn's rings as he listened to Leo explain the difference between an asteroid and a comet. This was their sustainable happiness. It was not a fairy tale ending written in headlines and glamour. It was a quiet, grounded partnership built on a foundation of trust that had been tested by fire. It was the comfort of his arm around her as they watched a movie after Leo was in bed, the easy silence between them as they read side by side, the shared smile over a cup of coffee in the morning. It was the way he looked at her, with a mixture of admiration, respect, and a deep, abiding affection that still made her breath catch in her throat. He loved her for her strength, for her integrity, for the quiet resilience that had carried her through the hardest years of her life. And she loved him for the man he was beneath the armor, the kind, vulnerable, and fiercely loyal man who had seen her when she was invisible and offered her not a rescue, but a partnership of equals. One cool autumn evening, she stood at her kitchen window, watching Julian and Leo in the backyard. They were raking leaves, but the task had mostly devolved into a joyous, chaotic leaf fight. Leo's shrieks of laughter filled the air as Julian, the powerful titan of industry, theatrically collapsed under a shower of red and gold maple leaves. A profound sense of peace settled over her, a warmth that had nothing to do with the heat from the oven where a chicken was roasting. She thought back to that wedding, to the woman she had been, sitting alone at table 17, wrapped in a fragile shell of dignity. It felt like a lifetime ago. She had gone to that wedding out of a sense of duty, expecting nothing more than an evening of quiet humiliation. She had faced it with her head held high, a small, solitary act of courage. And somehow, that single decision, that choice to show up for herself and her son, had been the catalyst for everything. A hand on her back, a simple question, a dance. A life she had thought was over had been given a new, extraordinary beginning. She watched the men she loved and the son she adored, and a quiet, certain thought bloomed in her heart. Everything, in the end, had led her here. She was finally home.